Do you think that teleportation is possible? Walking through
for
walls?
sure. For sure. And that's science. It's not woo-woo. I can prove it to you.
A science accepts there's multiple dimensions.
Yeah. Right now, science accepts that there's probably 11 and theoretically an infinite amount of dimensions. If you see the world one way, you won't see it another. Which is why, go talk to elderly people. God bless them. We can learn a lot from them. But over time, most of them crystallize in the way they're thinking. So you literally are jumping back in time.
There's a modern innovator named Elon Musk who created a company called Tesla.
Yeah.
There was a somewhat modern, but less modern, named Nikola Tesla.
Mm-hmm.
What happened to his technology, and do you think any of his technology was actually capable of what he said it was?
My understanding is yes, but humanity wasn't ready for it yet.
Welcome to the Mindful Leaders Podcast. I'm your host, Dylan Vanes, and today we have my good friend Sabastian Enges on the show. This conversation was a profound and deeply spiritual one. Sabastian was my first guest ever on my first podcast episode when I launched this podcast 3 years ago. And I brought him back for this podcast episode here as I launched season 3. We start the podcast off with one of the most profound questions life has to offer. And then we lead through a conversation around religion, theology, how to better ourselves as humans, and why are we here? Deeply spiritual conversation. If you're someone who's looking to better your life or understand what the purpose of us being here is, you'll be able to get questions answered from this podcast. I deeply enjoyed this one, and I hope you will too. So let's go ahead and dive into this episode. All right, so what is God?
Here we go again. I think the simple answer is God is. What is not God?
What does that mean?
God is the infinite expression of this. We could say God is expressed infinitely through all of creation. There is nothing that is not part of God. There's nothing that's separate from God.
It feels very abstract.
I know, but it's the most accurate thing I could say. It's like one of the illusions you surrender in the path of remembering, or awakening, as we like to call it in our culture, is this illusion of separateness, that you are somehow separate from God, or specialness, which is this idea that somehow I am specially fucked up or especially talented. And we like to think we're special in our fuck-uppery too. But in that illusion, you begin to realize I am not separate from God. That would be like saying a leaf is separate from the tree, or a solar flare is separate from the sun, or a wave is separate from the ocean. You are an expression in the ocean. You are an expression in the sun. You are an expression in leaf as a tree, right? So God is the creator of all. God is. What is not God? So this is tough, right? When people hear this, especially religious folk, for a number of reasons. One is, if God exists, how could there be evil? If God exists, how are children being murdered right now? Right? How does that happen? And so my answer to that is, if tonight you went to sleep, and in that sleep state you had a dream in which you were robbed, when you woke up, would you call the police? To understand the answer to that is to understand the truth of this reality, which quantum science and scientists are pointing to now, right? Another guy just came out and said, I'm pretty sure I can prove that we're living in a simulation, which would also explain why we haven't seen aliens. They're only going to show up if they're supposed to.
And they're not supposed to show up?
Not yet. Humanity's not ready. But we're getting close. We're getting damn close. Imagine if you, as a collective, had this insanely egocentric view of the world in which you were the most important thing in the world, only to find out there are other sentient beings, more powerful, more evolved, more loving, more compassionate in some cases.
Hasn't the government seen aliens?
I don't know for fact, but I wouldn't be surprised. In a simulation, and Elon Musk brought this up. He said, I've never seen aliens, but that may explain only further the point that it's because we're in a simulation and they would only show up at a certain level of the game. Right? Because the humanity isn't ready for some of the deeper truth still. And that's been the case. Like, look at all the avatars, whether it was Krishna, who, if you have not read the Gita, his conversation with Arjuna is brilliant. Whether it's Buddha, whether it was Christ, they were all speaking to, and they all lamented one way or the other. Hey, there's things I'd love to tell you. You're just not ready to hear them. Right? They all said that in their own language, but principally it's like, hey, there's lots of things that humanity is just not ready for. And then the Apostle Paul showed up later and said, I'd love to give you meat, but I still have to give you milk because you're just not ready to hear it. And that was why Christ lamented and constantly said, let those who have ears hear. What he's saying is, let those who have the ability to understand what I'm saying. And he spoke mostly in parable when he spoke to the masses because he knew those who could understand would, those who wouldn't freak the fuck out. And they still killed him, which is, one of the great ironies.
So if God is, how does one come to know what God is?
Come to know is probably most served through the process of unlearning and remembering what has always been. And that's the deep truth and witness that people come through. And more people are waking up right now. I'm not a doctor, I don't play them on the internet, but you see psychedelics playing a part in this, right? People going on ayahuasca retreats, doing shrooms or doing deep, deep breath work, and they're getting into these states and they're remembering what they have forgotten because they're able to create separation between themselves and their meat suit enough to remember, holy shit, I'm a spiritual being having a human experience, right? Where most of us, because of indoctrination through the process of becoming an adult, which is by design and largely useful early on, become very identified with our meat suit. We have to. It's part of a survival protocol. And so the remembering is, oh, right, I'm a spirit. That inside of that spirit is a body, not the other way around. So a lot of people think my soul is inside of me. It's quite the opposite. Your physical expression is inside of your spiritual body. So that is the remembering. Oh. And so for somebody, usually religious folk just are like, they freak out when they hear that because it challenges a lot of their beliefs. So I would say anybody who's being triggered by that or just tuning that out, just ask, how could that be? The thing about truth is if you seek it, it will find you. It's not hiding, right? You just have to want to hear it. And once you do, you'll hear it. It'll bear witness in your soul and you'll remember, oh yeah, I'm a spirit having a human experience.
Does that happen consciously? I'm consciously remembering?
You have a small, still voice of intuition that's constantly whispering in your ear. Sometimes we turn that off. But it is the function of conscious intention that brings that back into our awareness. But it's sitting there in the background. It's like think of like source code. If you could go in and look at your source code, it's sitting in there. It's not like it's not hiding. You just have to go find the frickin' source code and go, oh, right? And there's lots of things in our world that are pointing to it. And I think it's hilarious. I think it's hilarious that, which I think it's also appropriate or on par, but I think it's fun that somebody gets to pretend that God doesn't exist, right? That's part of the getting to exist in this world is getting to choose. What would it be like if God didn't exist, right? And that's generally what we refer to as an atheist, somebody that wants to believe that God does not exist. However, it's pretty hard to look around and not see the self-evident truth of creation all around us. You really, really have to turn off your filters in order to do that. For instance, your car is parked out in front of a palm tree. That palm tree is incredibly more sophisticated in its design and very well intelligently built, and yet we would look at that as an atheist and go, spontaneous, accident. Then we look at the car, that we would clearly go, oh, this is a Tesla, right? And we know its make, we know its model, we know its design, and go, man-made. How in the world can we look at two things side by side and clearly think one of them was created and the other one was an accident? I think that's fascinating.
Mm. So your suggestion then is that the tree was also created.
Totally. We know that. Science knows that. Just listen to the language. It's like, wait, this can't all be, there's too many patterns. There's too many reoccurring themes in creation to think that this was a accident. But it's a fun way to participate if you want to.
What you're saying, you said could be triggering for religious people. The fact, though, is what you're saying is very, it's like religion, but then you add all these layers on top of it. Would you agree with that statement?
That what I'm saying is religious at its core?
There's a spiritual element to it, but you're taking this like what someone has, let's say in Christianity, and then there's like, oh, like you're on the right track to some things, but there's also all the stuff that Christianity doesn't explain.
Right.
I'm hearing elements of that in what you're saying.
Yeah. And I don't really like when people say, this is mellowed out some. I'm not very fond of I'm not religious, I'm spiritual. I find it kind of funny when people say that. But
So what are you then?
spiritual. I'm a spiritual being having a human experience. But generally, when people use that phrase, it's in the context of, I don't want to subscribe to a set doctrine. I just want to do what feels good to me. And I know God's probably out there somewhere, but I'm just having my time here on earth, right? That statement. So, and it was overused for a while. It seems like it's mellowed out. But we use religion as a scaffolding, if you will, to help us remember these truths. And most of them have carried particular truths through the centuries. Most of them.
I feel like what you're saying is interesting, and then the question though is like how you come to that. I know you've studied theology.
Mm-hmm.
You've read many texts of it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, can you just give me some context on how many times you've read the Bible and these other books? And
Yeah, I've read the Bible probably a dozen-ish times.
back to front, or just in its whole entirety?
Yeah, well, I've read it in its entirety. I mean, I got a degree in biblical studies, so I'm pretty acquainted with the Bible. It's a huge book, and there's a lot of words. I've only a handful of times, like, okay, I'm going to start in Genesis 1 and end in Revelation. But I think in the overall time spent in that book, it's probably a dozen times. Which the reason was, when I dropped in here, I didn't come in with I never questioned God. I questioned humans. I found humans to be fascinating. Like, what are we doing here? And they all had their explanation for what God was, right? And they used their religions to tell their stories. And so I wanted to understand, well, where did you come up with all these stories of God? Where did they come from? I think they're fascinating, which is why I use the analogy. Like, some people, it's like if you knew Michael Jordan and you were really good friends with Michael Jordan, like genuinely good friends with him, and then you hung out with people who were like huge fans of Michael Jordan but have never met the dude, they may give you stats that you're like, yeah, I guess I never considered that he's 6'7", right? Or that he was a shooting guard, or, oh yeah, he's got 6 titles. Like, that isn't stuff that would necessarily be important to you, and they want to tell you all these things, but then the way they talk, you're like, oh, you don't actually know MJ. You just know of him, right? That's kind of a lot of religion. There's a lot of people who don't really remember who God is. They're using religion to point the way, and they get stuck in it in a very dogmatic way, which the Bible specifically, there was a great debate in, we'll say, the heavens for the moment, about whether to release a canon of Scripture, because a lot of beings knew it would likely be weaponized and used as a way to control people, just because of where human consciousness was. Which is fascinating.
You've looked at Christianity. Have you read any other texts?
The Hadith, the Quran, the Gita, the Book of Mormon. Looked into the Watchtower Society some, which is the group that the J-Dubs get their information from, which is pretty fascinating. Jehovah's Witness. The Hindus are pretty fascinating. Buddhism. Yeah, most of the main text. There's still, like, especially in Hindu and Buddhism, there's a lot of subtext and a lot of, like, old ancient script that I would not claim that I've read all of it. I find it fascinating, though. But the 3 main religions, which is Judeo-Christian, Muslim, right? Those are your 3. That accounts for 2/3 of the world's religions, which is crazy. And they all have the same backstory.
Which is what?
The Abrahamic law through Moses, Abraham, that storyline. They just depart. Abraham, and Christianity and Judaism, Abraham had a son, Isaac, through his wife, and in Islamic religions, various forms, he had a child with Hagar, Ishmael. And so that's where they kind of split in their history.
So are you saying that all religions are fundamentally the same?
I don't. that I would if the point is they are all attempting to explain something that they have forgotten. Sure. If you're saying they all do it well or at the same level, no. But where they are useful is that they do meet people at a certain level of consciousness. So for me, I would just invite anyone, look at the pervasive fruit of a particular religion. So take groups of people, take particular areas of the world, and go, hey, this is the main religion in this part of the world. What is the fruit of that? Is it poverty or is it wealth? Is it freedom or is it slavery? Is it violence or is it peace? To varying degrees. Now, we're having a human experience, so in a varying spectrum, those things show up in every religious group, but it's very pervasive. Just go Google the 10 most violent countries in the world, and then figure out which religion is the predominant religion there, and then go, weird. Why would that be the case? So I don't think they're all created equal. If that's what you mean.
They're not created equal, but there's truths that are in them that may correlate and be similar in nature.
Yeah. And I would say the mystics in all of them tend to agree. It's the doctrines of the dogmatic theologians that tend to create all the disharmony. But the mystics in all of them tend to say the same things, which I think is fascinating.
So they were created in some aspect to divide and create disruption?
No. You have, I don't think so anyway. They were created to reach a particular people group in a very particular time in history that were at a very particular level of consciousness. But you are informed, and your perspective is informed by your view of the world, right? So the way you look at the world is how you are going to communicate that out. So you can just tell the consciousness level of the people speaking by what they wrote and what they focused on, which I think is fascinating.
So with that being said, there's a lot of friction in society today. What do you think is creating all that division?
We're 99.9% the same, and the illusion of separateness is just that. It's an illusion. But we love to camp on that 0.01% in thinking that we are different. And for whatever reason, we're obsessed with those differences, and those differences create division. When we surrender to the human experience and we begin to recognize we are all having a human experience and we are not separate from one another, the world will change. Humans as a species are still incredibly primitive. We're still using violence and control to try to figure out how to deal with this world. We'll know we're at another level when violence isn't even on the table. We don't need to use violence. But the survival protocol of human mostly responds to fear and pain still, which makes sense from a pure design standpoint.
So you have a program called Quantum Academy.
Mm-hmm.
Shameless plug. What is the quantum and what does that mean?
The quantum is actually the smallest unit, or this that we measure, quanta, but it's taking things down to their basic organizing principles, as it is referred to with Quantum Academy. It's taking it down to the building blocks by design.
So people talk about in spiritual communities quantum physics and quantum mechanics. Like, what does that actually mean?
Well, it's the current newest form of physics. So we had Newtonian physics that dealt with the physical world, that which could be observed. We had the atomic physics that was really introduced by Einstein in a big way. And then the subatomic, which is where quantum physics come in. We're like, we want to know, okay, we see a physical table. This is solid. That's Newtonian physics. Einstein tells you, well, it's made up of molecules that are made up of particular atoms that are made of. Well, what's beyond that? When you go beyond that, you're going into a world that doesn't technically exist. We don't know what to do with that. It goes to nothing. It just disappears, which I've heard multiple people point to the density of the table. If you were to look at the density of this table and the space between the molecules that make this table look dense, they are actually further apart from a ratio standpoint than the stars in the universe, which is pointing to the idea that this is largely an illusion, which Einstein was kind of getting to more than once.
This is an illusion because why?
We experience solid.
Yeah.
We experience this as solid, but there is more space between the molecules in this table than there are the space between the stars from a ratio standpoint. So it's like, well, what makes this solid? That's quantum physics. It's like, wait, what? Did we agree that this is something? And our agreement is what makes it what it is, which was the Heisenberg principle, right? When we were 1920s, late 1920s, when they left, they were splitting protons. And while they were observing it, they split perfectly. And then when they stopped observing it, they kept the thing recording, and it went into a expression of wave potentiality, meaning it didn't take an actual path. It was an expression of all the potential paths. It only created a single path when it was being observed, which for a long time they were like, the machine must be broke. This doesn't make sense. And began to realize, oh, we are co-creating. That's part of remembering. We are co-creating this world. It exists because we agree that it exists.
That's known as the double slit experiment, right?
Yes, exactly.
So then if a tree falls in the woods, does it make a sound?
If no one is there to hear it. Yeah. That's a great question.
We don't know.
No. But I can say this, hot and cold don't exist. Pain and pleasure don't exist. Those are all perceptions that we describe. Those are all things that don't exist in the universe. They exist within us. So then we could get to, well, how much of that, right? That opens up the door to, well, how much of what we experience is our perception? And I would offer most of it, if not all of it. We are, by design, getting to enjoy a subjective reality. And that's kind of what quantum physics is pointing at. It's like we got curious. We're like, physical world. Oh, Newtonian physics. Einstein came along. It was like, atomic world. Oh, that's fascinating. And then we're like, well, what's beyond the atom? Nothing. It just disappears into quanta that go into the A field, which literally are described as little packets of information that are held in consciousness. It's weird. It's like the Bible in Genesis 1 there said, God spoke the world into existence through creation, consciousness. And then here's quantum physics going, well, at the very lowest level here, it just looks like there's packets of information that then create what we want them to be.
What you're saying sounds like I try to explain this to one of my college buddies. They'll just think I'm some pseudoscientist.
Yeah. Well, there's a few things. Anybody who's hearing this is like, what the fuck? Feel that way. That's totally, feel it deeply. But then ask yourself, why do I feel that way? And be really honest with yourself. What makes me want to respond to that way? Why am I having this emotional response? I can hit you with the punchline. We are all deeply controlled by our psychological need to identify accurately. Whatever we think we are, we have a psychological need to protect. So if I have an identity tied to a belief system and something challenges that belief system, I will respond emotionally. And it's obvious if you've done sales or negotiation or tried disciplining a child and there seems to be a overreaction or a trigger to something, you're like, oh, your identity is tied to this. This is why you don't enjoy this conversation. Once you surrender those identities and you go back to I am, it's like, why do I care what somebody else thinks? Why do I care what I think? What in me needs to care? What is there to care about? Why can't I just be the observer? Why can't I just bear witness to what is?
So I've heard the statement I am from people before, and they're like, well, it's a powerful statement. Didn't make sense to me for some time. What does that mean?
When at the end of the day, you're willing to strip away every one of your identities, all you will be left with is I am. Everything after that is a temporary expression of infinite reality. That is God. Going back to your first question. Which is fun. So, where people get stuck is we create stories of our identity. And right now in our culture, we are obsessed with identity. Hilarity. I would like to suggest for anyone, try it on for size, that when you leave your meat suit, you are not a race, you are not a religion, you are not a sex, you are not a color, whatever the fuck else we want to identify with. None of that comes with you. Now, the experiences you gain from that do, but not your identity to any of those things. But man, we want to camp on them right now in our society. And I know why. We're in an existential crisis. We don't know what to believe. We don't know who to believe in or what to believe in. So then we really start doubling down on our story of identity. which has a beautiful end, I think, but it will come to an end.
What is dream interpretation?
It's a fascinating question. Dreams, as far as I can tell, and I've studied a decent amount of it, and Carl Jung, who was a protege of Freud, did a decent amount of dream interpretation, understanding dreams. As far as I could tell, from a neurological standpoint, dreams are one of the ways your brain purges or defrags, right? So if you think about a computer defragging, dreams are one of the ways that your mind defrags, which is why when you have dreams, the number one thing that I try to help my clients with, especially if it's a dream that's particularly disturbing or stands out to them, the question I'll ask them is, the number one question is, what was the predominant emotional experience you had through this dream? And then when you woke up, what was the predominant emotional experience that lingered? That, for me, has been a better tool or more helpful in understanding what the human experience is versus trying to interpret why they're walking across a bridge and a whale goes underneath them and above them is a jet and like all these like random imagery. As far as I could tell from that, there's layers to dreams, but that is mostly designed to help you defrag, which is why REM sleep, for anybody who tracks QS data, right, is so important because that's the dream state. And REM seems to help your brain purge and help you clean up your emotional state. And so anything you didn't process or things that you didn't process, your brain can then go do while you're sleeping. You can also, as we're expressed in multiple realities and multiple infinite realities, you can also exist in a dream state where you, while your body sleeps, you get to go play, which a lot of us enjoy doing. It's like, hey, the body's sleeping, let's go. Because you, as an infinite being, don't have zero desire, don't have a need to sleep. You don't need to sleep. So sometimes you can bounce around and people do lucid dreaming or walk about or leave their body, astral travel. And those are fun things that you can do that are generally considered dream states as well.
Can you get stuck?
Can you get stuck? Yes, evidently you can. Good question.
Okay.
You can get stuck out of your body, which I guess is risky if you don't know what you're doing.
I've heard people say like they'll follow their belly button back in or something.
Yeah, I don't know that. but you can. It sounds like you can get detached from your physical body somehow.
So that would, again, support the theory that we're separate from our physical body.
We are more than our physical body. Our physical body would be an expression of us, but we are expressed in infinite realities. So you could, in theory then, be expressed, like, I have a 6-month-old son, Jackson, and for me, it's a joy to watch as his spirit creates this physical body that he's living in and is learning how to interface in this rule, in this realm, based on the rules of this realm. So he's learning how to use his hands, his feet. He's learning how to communicate. But what was there from day one is an intense desire to connect. That is spirit, eye-to-eye contact. And it's beautiful when we travel with him. He just makes eye contact, heavy eye contact with people. And I've seen people cry. I've seen people laugh. It's like, well, why? Because there's a deep spiritual being that inherently knows how to do that, but is still learning how to use the meat suit, right? And so because of the density of this realm, as far as I understand, your spirit kind of drips in, not all at one time. And that starts while you're still in the womb. It starts to just, as you kind of acclimatize.
Like downloading. Or uploading.
Yeah, exactly. That would be a great way of expressing it.
Have you ever seen someone die?
Yes. My parents, for one.
You were there with them while they passed?
I was there specifically with my mom. I held her hand while she took her last breath. Yeah.
Is there a smoky mist that floats up?
I don't know about a smoky mist. It was interesting. We had some family there, and then the hospice nurse, and I was leaving to go get them ice cream, and I walked out the door, and as I walked out the door, I heard a very specific audible voice say, "Your mom's going home, go back in there." So I walked back in, and I'm like, I think she's cashing out right now. And then so we started singing Amazing Grace. That was her favorite song. And within halfway through that song, she took a last kind of audible. And and what I felt, I don't think wouldn't be fair in me to say I visually saw this. It was more of an intuitive feeling more than but a release and then immediate peace and joy. It wasn't grief. It wasn't sadness. It was as if her spirit let go of the meat suit that she had been holding on to, and she was able to fully express herself on her way out. Yeah.
You'll hear people who are more like rational or logical type of people have experiences similar to that, yet still deny the existence of
right
consciousness.
He who's good with a hammer sees everything as a nail. Rational thought can only take you so far. And that's where we are in science right now, which is really fun. Science has become our new religion. It's the new Catholic Church. It's hilarious. And that's because, well, humans are human. And we continue to make the same mistakes in different modalities. Well, what do I mean? What was the issue with the Catholic Church? Well, they wanted to control everything. They wanted to tell you what to believe. They wanted to not be questioned, right? When Copernicus said, hey, turns out it looks like this is a heliocentric universe, not a geocentric universe. Hope that doesn't fuck with your doctrine too much. They put him under house arrest. Like, no, this could never be. God, we are the center of all things, right? So that's how they got themselves in some distrust. And then as people started checking out the things they were saying, it's like, you're full of shit, right? And then Protestant dude, Martin Luther, comes along and he's like, wait a minute. You motherfuckers, you're just saying this shit because nobody can read Latin. And as he's starting to read the scripture, he's like, dude, you're teaching all sorts of bullshit. So he put the tenets of faith on the Catholic wall, and the Protestant movement was started. Okay. What's science doing right now? What's the scientific community doing right now? The arrogance is disgusting. We know best. Just trust us. We know everything. Don't question us. Don't challenge us. You see it everywhere. Well, what do? We just made science our new religion. The problem with the rational thought is quantum physics. A lot of people don't want to fuck around with quantum physics because it really starts to fuck with the rest of the scientific community. So like, nah, I'm not going to pay attention to it, right? It's a lot in the scientific community. It's like right? Einstein called it spooky at a distance. He's like, I don't know what to do with this, but he at least had the mind that would be willing to entertain it. A lot of the scientific community stays away from it because it starts to challenge a lot of what they believe. Their identity, their story of a thing is tied to their belief system, just like everyone else. Now, science, or the scientific method, the scientific method is brilliant. It's beautiful, and it is a great way, a great tool for interpreting our world, for understanding our world, for interfacing with the world. So in no way am I discounting the power of science from a scientific method standpoint, but when you give humans power, it just turns into the same dogmatic shit that's always been. And we saw that with COVID. If a doctor said, wait a minute, this doesn't add up. Oh, you need to shut up. You don't know what you're talking about. We know best, right? 4 years later, CDC, yeah, it turns out COVID, kind of treat it like the flu. Like, fuck you, right? That's just the pompous part of the scientific community now, which I know my scientific friends would be, "Arr." And there's a lot of amazing people in the scientific community. I'm not dissing the community. It just, over a long enough period of time, you're starting to say, oh, repeat behavior here. Just now it's not a church, it's the scientific church.
So if science believes one thing and maybe there's stuff that science can't explain or they're not willing to explain, are there other sources of technology and innovation that exist that we're not tapping into?
Well, that's what's happening. So as we come up against this wall, which is happening, right? Because the scientific method is predicated upon empirical data. Well, empirical data has its limits, first of all, which is super fascinating in and of itself. But you really get stuck if you hold to the scientific method in its current state before quantum physics. You're stuck in the third dimension. You have no way to go beyond the third dimension because you cannot observe it. Listen, anybody try to, they understand, scientific community understands in theory that there are multiple dimensions, and mathematically prove there's multiple dimensions, but has no way to express it or see it, right? So it gets to its limits where it's like, hey, we can't explain things outside of the first three dimensions, which is where they're at. Quantum physics can go beyond that. It takes very brilliant minds to be able to understand that, mostly because you have to surrender what you think you know. And going back to identity, that's incredibly hard for most people. Because you become, in the scientific community, it's largely understood that if you don't come up with a new theory by the time you're 35, you most likely won't, because you become crystallized in your thinking. You subscribe to a paradigm of the world, and the opportunity cost of that paradigm is if you see the world one way, you won't see it another. Which is why, like, go talk to elderly people. God bless them. We can learn a lot from them. But over time, most of them crystallize in the way they're thinking. So you literally are jumping back in time. Part of the human experience.
I've heard that technology that we have now, that there may have been technologies in ancient or older times that have been different. When I think of technology, I think of this and this.
Yes.
What is true technology?
Well, you see this. So Aristotle made this point. I believe it was Aristotle, maybe it was Plato. But he said the art and literature of today is a foreshadow of tomorrow. So you can look at themes in art and literature, which for us is movies, music, art, and see that there are reoccurring themes that are coming back, specifically, we'll say in fantasy and science fiction. Going somewhere with this, stay with me. One of them is this introduction of spirituality and technology, science and spirituality crossing over. You see this strongly in themes in fantasy books, sci-fi, think Star Wars, think Lord of the Rings. Like those are the, like, it's pretty pervasive. The Wheel of Time, which is a big one that's really popped. It's this reintroduction into the collective, this idea of the crossover of science and spirituality, whereas for the last 300-something years, they've been at odds with each other, right? And that's part of the opportunity cost is you get so sold on this that you totally discount all of this. And so what you're going to see happen is we're going to see the reintroduction of spiritual technologies into our communities that will, and you see it already, that are challenged, that are attacked, that are told it's woo-woo, it's not real, it's fake, because I can't perceive it because of my rational brain. Eventually, those technologies will get strong enough that it will bring the scientific community to its knees. Meaning there will be, you can't just keep saying spontaneous remission. You can't just constantly say, oh, I don't know how to explain this, but it happened. It'll get to a point where, like, something we were talking about earlier, chopping a piece of metal with your hand, although cool, without practical application, probably isn't going to get a lot of people. But when you start walking through walls, walking through water, showing up on the other side of the world, that's going to get a lot of people's attention. And we're like, well, we don't know how to explain this. Well, yeah, because you're trapped in the first three dimensions. And it's science. It's just spiritual science, which I would say spiritual science is probably the expression of things that are unseen by empirical data, which right now science has no way to deal with. So it trusts what it sees. That's a problem, especially in this day and age. How do you trust what you see? How can you be certain of what you are seeing? This is why it's going to be a really fun time and a bit of a rodeo for the scientific community.
So you think that teleportation is possible? Walking through walls?
For sure. For sure. And that's science. It's not woo-woo. I can prove it to you. Every dimension is superior to the last dimension. And we know that. That's a science.
So science accepts there's multiple dimensions.
Yeah. Right now, science accepts that there's probably 11 in theoretically an infinite amount of dimensions. Right? Okay. So we know that. Every dimension is superior to the last dimension. If you live on one plane of existence, plane one, you're just a point. That's it. 2 planes, you can move forward and backwards. 3 planes, you can move forward, backwards, and up. Every dimension is superior to the last and can see all of the last. Thus, its movements would look mythical or magical to somebody who lives in the 3rd dimension if you were moving in the 4th or 5th dimension, which would make it look like you're walking through a wall, when in fact you're just moving in the 5th dimension. Make sense?
Mm-hmm.
At least in a theoretical.
Like have you seen Interstellar?
Yeah.
When he's like behind the wall?
As an example. But that more has to do with time, space-time, but it applies in the same way. It's every dimension is superior to the last. So if you're moving in the 5th dimension to somebody who lives in the 3rd dimension, it's going to look like you just walked through a wall or just showed up out of nowhere. That to me is like a foregone conclusion. And you will see more and more people do it.
Mm.
And there are people that are doing it, just we're still in that stage of like trying to explain it away. At some point it will become so pervasive that we won't be explaining it away. The problem with this is there is a design element and some very responsible creation to not introduce things to a primitive group of people that would cause more harm than good.
So will we experience this in our lifetimes?
Yeah, those are always tough questions to answer, because if you ask a being that does not live in the human, it's a little bit easier if you talk to a being that lived as a human that is no longer in a meat suit. But if you're talking to a being that has never been human, now is all there is of time. So they would say, yes, of course, because they're speaking to the great eternal now, and now is always. So they would say yes. If you're looking at our time scales, it's a harder answer, because
Our human experience.
Yeah, and our human
likely.
perception. Yeah. It sounds like, yes, it is happening and will continue to happen and amplify.
What will?
Demonstrations of what would be considered supernatural.
In our human lifetime.
Yeah. And they have been happening.
When you say sounds like yes, what's...
I'm inquiring. I'm just asking. So,
Okay.
But Christ did this, right? Whether you think it was an allegory, whether you think he was a real dude, Christ walked on water. He walked through walls.
I could go for some bread right now.
Yeah, and some wine.
Yeah.
Yeah, or maybe some fish. Yeah, so
there's a modern innovator named Elon Musk who created a company called Tesla.
yeah.
There was a somewhat modern but less modern named Nikola Tesla.
Mm-hmm.
What happened to his technology, and do you think any of his technology was actually capable of what he said it was?
My understanding is yes, but humanity wasn't ready for it yet. When you see this throughout history, like when we're not ready for something, it's like, think about this as a concept. If you and I dropped in to the 1500s and hung out with Leonardo da Vinci with our cell phones, he may have a mind to understand what is going on, but everyone else would think we were into witchcraft. Or why? Well, because I can FaceTime my friend. Where's your friend? On another continent. What? No way. He's on that screen. Your friend's in the box? You put your friend inside of that? Witchcraft. They don't have a way. There's no way for them to even comprehend or perceive the technology. So they're going to label it something inherently evil, which is generally what humans do when they don't understand something. Which, if you just study history, it's like, yeah, we continue to do this. Which is the arrogance of religion and just the human experience. What we don't understand, we generally label and we judge. And then later on, as we elevate our consciousness and our perception updates, we're like, oh, well, that's easier to understand, easier to explain. But think about that. If we were up in the 1500s, especially we were walking around a church and we're talking to friends on this thing, it's like, oh, it's demon possessed. I could just hear it. There would be all sorts of labels because you're trying to explain a technology they have no way to understand. So it's the same thing right now. There is technology that exists that most human beings have no way to understand. Because they have no way to understand it, they inherently think it's evil. Why? Because our design protocol, which is predicated upon our survival, tells us anything new is bad. And that's kept us alive forever. Which is why change is so painfully slow in human perception.
So if humanity wasn't ready, but if you look back, there's other types of things like that may have existed before, like modern civilization.
Yep.
Are we going through cycles where humanity is like resetting?
Yes. But as far as I can tell, this is our third go-around. Third time of blowing everything up and starting over.
Okay.
And we're on the precipice of either elevating, which I'm pretty confident we're going to do, or we're going to reset this whole bitch. Einstein said that. Einstein was asked, hey, how do you think World War III is going to be fought? He goes, I'm not sure how World War III is going to be fought, but I'm quite certain World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. What is he? He's just predicting a grand reset. Now, that doesn't have to be the choice. The other choice is we elevate consciousness to a level where we change how we show up. We change how we deal with our problems. We change how we treat one another. We change how we prioritize resources. Now, we have the logistics and infrastructure at this point to make sure that every human being on Earth has clean water and food. The resources are there. It isn't a priority. We have technology that can heal people, that can prevent, or that's more focused on preventive medicine. The problem is it's not financially lucrative. So until enough people go, hey, there's got to be more to this than just profit. people have to be part of the equation, we'll continue to see this, which is, I think, where we're going as a people group, meaning humans.
Humans have this fixation on materialism and success. What do you think success is?
I think success is what you define it as, but humans, you're not inaccurate by saying that humans have a desire to accumulate, and that also seems to be tied to a survival protocol. But capitalism as a economic system is predicated upon consumerism. The whole system is built on consumerism. And that's important to understand, because at some point we're going to have to reconcile that. You cannot continue, right? So what is a recession? A recession is 2 quarters of negative economic growth. The biggest driver of economic growth? Consumption, right?
Mm-hmm.
So if we have a recession, everything starts tanking. We're like, oh my God, we're not growing anymore. Why? Because we're not consuming as much. We have an inherent problem when that's our system, right? And Ray Dalio brought this up when he's talking about short-term and long-term debt cycles and how they are going to play historically into this. And then Neil Howe wrote a book called Generations, and then The Fourth Turning, which goes into, hey, there's patterns to this. This isn't, we're not new to this. And if you study history, you start to see, oh, there are patterns to this. So, yeah, consumerism is part of the human priority survival protocol, I would guess. But capitalism, which is pervasive in a lot of the world now, is all about consumerism. And so it trains people to be consumers instead of producers. It's the ongoing fleecing and the accumulation of wealth by the few at the cost of the many who are in their automatons. They're just consuming. Consume. So how does this change? When we stop consuming. How many fucking pairs of shoes do you need?
100.
Right? Like, as an example. It's just there's so much waste. And what's happening is you're seeing this minimalist movement where more and more people are going back to less is more. More and more you're seeing people desire experiences over things. Right? And realizing you can only have so much, and then it's just, ugh. You know? You can only have 100 pairs of shoes before it doesn't feel the same anymore. Or whatever it is. The biggest house, the biggest car. Sure. It's like, get the fuck out of here. You know?
What do you think is the hardest lesson that humans have to go through in this experience?
The most challenging lesson is in remembering, because the illusion of this world is very persistent. And it's persistent. And I think what's happening is we live in an economy that is largely built on attention, which is brilliant because we are one step from waking up. Once we can begin to take stewardship of our attention and budget our attention and stop being distracted from what's out there, we'll start looking at what's in here. Once that happens, humans are going to start popping off. What's happened is we are largely distracted. Everything out there, bright, shiny, bright, shiny, bright, shiny, everything out there, where all the work is in here. And that's the hardest lesson. But that's what you see the sages, you see the monks, you see the people who are very awake. They're just not distracted by the shit around them. One of my favorite Fabian Perez painting, it's in my office, and if you ever see my backdrop for some of my content and podcasts, you'll see it. It's a picture of this older dude sitting in the bar, drinking his wine, and he's turned his back to the world, and all the young men are in their hats and their nicest clothes, and I believe they're looking, in the full picture, they're looking at a beautiful woman on stage, and they're all focused out there, and he's turning his back to it like, nah. And I love that. I don't know if that's what he meant by it. I don't know the dude, but I love it, and that's what it means to me. It's this reminding that it's the inner work is where all the juice is. And that's the hardest challenge because we're constantly distracted.
There's a lot of men have this, they could never do that, right? This beautiful woman, why do you think that the dynamic of men and women, that in current society, men have always dominated?
They haven't always dominated. In fact, the last millennia, they didn't.
In our current society, though.
Yeah.
They do, right?
Yeah. The masculine protocol is different than the feminine. It's a different tool set. He who's good at the hammer sees everything as a nail. So men, the body, the physical meat suit of male is designed for strength and speed, protection and provision. And so in a world in which you perceive that protection and provision is number one, you will build a world that reflects that. And we have. That's why we're still very primitive. We use violence to solve our problems because that's the protocol. What's changing is we're starting to go, wait, maybe this isn't the way we want to show up. Maybe there is a different way. And so I think that has led us to where we're at. And when we react to error, we cause only more error, right? So at some point, the masculine wanted to dominate everything, including the feminine, and the feminine eventually pushed back. The problem is when you react to error, you only cause more error. So now we're fucking with the masculine very, very hard, right? And now countless amounts of women reach out to me going, where are all the men? Where are all the masculine men? What happened to them? I'm like, well, we may want to look
at this table.
We want to may look at the conditions that created that world, right? Well, how does that happen? And not in a point the finger way and a like, hey, we may want to learn from our mistakes. We may want to learn from our decisions, potentially.
Why do you think women feel so misunderstood in today's society?
I don't know if they do or not. I wouldn't boldly speak for women on that, but to the degree anyone feels misunderstood, it's an inability to see the world through somebody else's eyes. Again, he who's good with a hammer sees everything as a nail. One of the skills of waking up, becoming more aware, is being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes. Right? So, to the best of my ability, I can put myself in the shoes of a woman that lived in the 1800s, the early 1900s, and go, I couldn't vote. I couldn't even have my own fucking credit card until the 1970s. Like, I was treated like I was fragile. I was treated as if I was less than, that my emotions were a weakness. So fuck that. I could get that. Again, male. I am male. I do what I do. Woman. Right? Just low levels of consciousness. So it pushes back. That makes sense to me. I have no problem empathizing with that experience and going, yeah, I could see why there was massive pushback against that. Because it's not everything. It appears that this is reality and creation in general, but it certainly applies to at least the first 3 dimensions of this world, the first 5 dimensions of this world. Everything is seeking homeostasis. The universe is seeking homeostasis, balance, constantly. And so when we get too far out of whack one way, it comes swinging back the other way. Always seeking balance.
Why do you think couples fight in relationships?
As long as they're, even if there's one person, you could fight. But I think I'll start by creating a framework. There are 3 leading indicators of lasting success in a relationship. And one of them is a clear vision. Second is clear values. And a functional way to deal with conflict. Conflict is normal in that disagreement is normal. You have 2 humans with totally different perceptions or mildly different perceptions. One way or the other, they have different perceptual ways of looking at the world. That's going to create disagreement. We just don't have the tools to deal with those disagreements. And because we're not socially, emotionally intelligent enough to interface there, law of averages is a lot of people are going to break up. We get to what, and most people come into relationship trying to get a need met. So they're prioritizing their need first on an unconscious level in most cases and without ever giving it a second thought. Well, you're already off to a bad start if you're first prioritizing what can I gain from this person, right? And that's, you see it. So when I'm trying to gain something as a resource, whether it be food, money, prestige, sex, whatever the fuck it is, if you now have a resource that I want or that I get from you, if I am not conscious enough to understand what I'm doing, I will likely inherently try to control you because you are the source of that resource. So I will control you in different ways to try to make sure that I'm insured that resource going forward. It's pretty animal.
Why do you think that couples fall out of love?
Because they fell into love. You can't fall out of something you didn't fall into. I think the idea of falling in love is pretty silly, which doesn't sound very romantic, I know. It doesn't mean it's not fun. It doesn't mean that it's not pleasurable. It's intoxicating. But you kind of have to understand what it is. My biochemical makeup is attracted to your biochemical makeup based on my blueprint of the world and how closely you represent what it is that I think I want. And it's an intoxicating biochemical concoction. But that's not love. It's a biochemical concoction. That is part of the design protocol, by the way, because what does it drive? Procreation, right? Sex drive is an incredibly important function if you were trying to design a creature to exist long enough to become conscious. There needs to be two imperatives. And Freud brought this up, right? He said, for all of his peccadillos, I think he did more cocaine than could kill a small horse. But he said human behavior is driven by largely two things, Thanos and Eros. Thanos is aggression, Eros is sex, psychologically. Okay, well, go look at all the advertising in the world right now. What is it?
Thanos is what?
Thanos is aggression.
Okay.
Right? Or the fear, from fear, right? Aggression, protection. Look at all of the advertising in the world. It's one of two things, fear or sex. Fear of loss, fear of what I'm not getting, or sex. Why? Because I don't think it's some evil mastermind group of people that are, we know what to do with humans. No, it's a design protocol. It's inherent to humans. We respond to those two things until we become conscious, because then we can choose to respond or not to. But if you're still animal, which by the way, 85% of humans are not aware, there is no choice. You're just responding to your environment. Stimulus, response. So falling in love is a design protocol that would ensure, to a high degree, procreation. Procreation is necessary if you're trying to get a species to live long enough to procreate and become conscious. Aggression, fear, also important. If your protocol was based on pleasure more than pain, they'd die out quick. There'd be no desire to fight, no desire to continue to survive. Just right? And you see that when people get all blissed. Fear is a much better driver of human behavior, which I loathe, but understand it from a design standpoint.
You said 85% of humans are not conscious?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Aren't aware.
Aren't aware. What does that mean?
So there was a fascinating study that was done that found that 96% of humans believe they're self-aware, right?
Mm-hmm.
Same study found that only about 15% of the population is actually aware.
Self-aware.
Self-aware, yeah.
Meaning they're aware of their actions?
They're aware of two things. Glad you asked. Awareness comes down to two components. Perception of the outside world, so your awareness of how others are experiencing you, your awareness of others' emotional condition, your awareness of how others are showing up energetically, emotionally. And then internally, how I'm showing up, what emotions I'm experiencing, my perceptions and stories about the world, my beliefs about the world. It's all there. It's in your programming, but most people don't bother to observe it. They don't question it. And you'll know any area of your life where you continue to get an unintended consequence, you lack awareness. Any area of your life where you continue to get an unintended consequence, you lack awareness. And for the most part, the unaware will say things like, well, that's just the way I was raised. That's how it is in my country. That's how it is in my culture. That's how it is in my family. That's how I was educated. That's what I went to school for. It's a story about a thing, which is beautiful to understand and to empathize with. But humans are not inherently logical. They're inherently emotional, and they use logic to back up their emotions, which is fascinating. It has implications.
What makes women attractive to men?
Beyond design protocol? I mean, there's pheromones. There's a biological aspect to that. There are pheromones in different times of the month. A woman will emit different pheromones. Those pheromones have a different impact on man or the masculine based on that. And that's all design. That's biological design, which is fascinating, right? So the closer they are to ovulating, meaning the more likely they are to be able to give birth, the more likely they'll be found more attractive because they're releasing a pheromone that makes selection more agreeable, which is fascinating. Also problematic if you're in the hookup culture, because there's a good chance that that sexual attraction, especially if it's very deep and driven by a biological urge, is probably tied to a design protocol to procreate, which might have unintended consequences.
Hopefully not twins.
Hopefully not twins.
Or hopefully, depending on what you want.
Yeah.
How could a woman make herself more attractive for men?
Well, if we're talking about a conscious human or an unconscious human, at the animal level, most of that is pretty well programmed in. Men, the masculine, likes the chase. It likes the hunt. It likes conquest. So at a very low level of consciousness, animal behavior, that's it. Also, by the way, you don't actually have to be that attractive of a woman. You just have to be the most attractive woman in that circle. We know that statistically. It doesn't meaning it's more about what are the other opposing options. So you could be, it will say not that physically attractive, whatever subjective that reality is. But if you are the most attractive of the group of women that are around, or you're the only woman around, you still have a very high chance of mate selection simply because of the design protocol. But that's low level of consciousness. If you're talking about fairly awake human beings, there's lots of other things that go into that. Energetic connection, lifetimes of connection, compatibility, suitability, honesty, authenticity. And I think if you're looking for a mate as a woman or as a man, the most profound thing you could do is to be overtly you. Be authentically you. For you, not for anyone else. The easiest way for the right people to find you is to make yourself obvious by being truly and deeply you. There's nothing more exhausting than trying to be something for someone else that you are not innately.
Is there any relationships that a female should look for in their partner on how they treat other people in their family to see how they may treat them?
Totally. I mean, there's the relationship with their mother. If I'm a woman and I'm looking to date a man, I'd like to understand their relationship to their mother. How do they treat their mother? What is their story about mother? Especially in a world that seems to be producing boys who are looking for moms more than men who are looking for a partner. So I'd look at that. I'd look at that relationship and what is their story about the feminine. I'd also look at their models, their masculine models of the world. What were those like? Those will give you clues. And it's the same thing. If I'm a dude looking for a great female partner, what's their relationship with their dad? What's their story about the masculine? What was their model of growing up, of what the feminine, how the feminine shows up? Those are at least good starting places.
How do you think people move towards happiness in their lives?
Your happiness equation is tied to your blueprint, whatever your blueprint is. So everybody has a blueprint of this is what happiness looks like. And it's largely informed by how we grew up. Happiness is not the same thing as joy or even bliss. You can enjoy joy even in suffering. If you come back to being witness, you can find joy even in suffering because what you're finding joy in is the human experience. Oh, this is what pain is. Wow. Oh, this is what grief feels like. Wow. Right? It's like watching a really good movie. Think about it. What's the difference? Somebody will sit down and watch a really good movie. They'll cry, they'll laugh, they'll feel a whole spectrum of emotions, and then they step away from it and generally reset. That is literally the world we're living in.
I hate movies. I either fall asleep in them or I get too sad and I have to fast forward the sad part.
I got to get through it.
And get to the happy part.
I get it. But your happiness is tied to your blueprint of the world. What you think it is to be happy.
What separates high performers from low performers?
The willingness to do what it takes at the core. And then self-awareness. When you look at people with sustained success over decades, there's 4 components that show up consistently. 1, they're self-aware. 2, they're agile learners, meaning they're constantly learning and growing. 3, they're fantastic communicators. And 4, they're influencers. Not in the fucking title, but in the actual word.
Bikinis and big booties on Instagram.
Yeah, kills me.
Anything you look for in red flags in an interview that other business owners might want to look for when hiring?
Yeah, there's 2 pieces to hiring great people. One is the competency piece. The other is the cultural piece. A lot of times we chase skill and we don't pay attention to mentality and character. The key is both. It's not just the skill set they have, it's also the mentality and character of the person. As a coach, I've seen thousands of people at this point in my life, and the number one thing that holds them back consistently isn't skills. I'm not saying that skills aren't important or that they don't hold people back. They do at times. But the big predominant levers that hold people back is mentality and character. So I'm going to grade on mentality and character far more than skill sets, generally, especially in our day and age where skill sets are very easy to acquire for the most part.
If you're interviewing someone and they're talking poorly about their previous employer, is it because their previous employer was a bad employer?
Could be. I wouldn't know. When somebody talks about somebody else, whether it be an employer, a girlfriend, a boyfriend, a mutual friend, a stranger, I almost never learn about the person being talked about, but I learn a lot about the person talking. Because you're sharing your worldview and your perception of the world based on how you're describing it. So it's the asshole test, right? Two people go out and they go hang out with somebody. They meet a new person. One person thinks they're an asshole. The other person thinks they're great. Which one of them is right? Well, they're both right, but one of them's an asshole. It's the asshole test. You describe the world the way you are. So when it comes to interviewing, is it possible that somebody had a poor candidate experience or a poor experience with an employer? Fuck yeah, of course. Totally possible. I'm not necessarily judging the employer based on what I'm sharing. I am understanding what's important to the employee as they share. If they're offering information that I didn't ask for in dissing the employer, I'll note that. Like, why are you sharing this with me? 2, if I go through their job history, in the last 3 jobs, they all left for the same reason, and they described the employer the same way, what do all 3 employers have in common?
The same person?
The same person, right? So what's the chances it's the employer? It's kind of like, thanks for the warning. And there's a good chance, statistically a good chance, that it's the person, not the job. Is that complete? No. Somebody could have, I wouldn't use the word unlucky because I think we're creating our own realities. It is possible that somebody had 3 horrific employers, but there's a good chance it's somehow tied to them. It's the same thing if you had a friend, it was like 3 bad boyfriends and they all ended the same way. It's like, well, what do all 3 of those boyfriends have in common? What do all 3 of those girlfriends have in common? And again, if you lack awareness, there's no protocol to solve for yourself. So you'd say something like, they're all bitches, they're all assholes, they're all liars, whatever it is, because you have no way to solve for yourself. You're not aware. That's 85% of humanity. And the way for those who are, there's an old saying, those who are awake do not judge those who are asleep. There is no reason to judge the person that is asleep. Gently nudge them awake.
It's also a high likelihood that that person that you're going to hire would then go on to talk crap about you at their next employer.
Totally.
So.
Or if it's a boyfriend. Or if you have a friend, let me tell you, if you have a friend that every time you're around them, they fucking gossip about everyone else in their life, let me help you. They're gossiping about you too.
Dude, this has been fun, man. How can people connect with you?
This has been awesome, brother. I always enjoy our conversations. Easiest way to get me is Sabastian Enges at any platform. I'm on all of them now. And there's only one account for all of them.
Are you
PSA? And it's SA, not
the guys
SE.
asking for crypto are probably not the real you.
Probably not the real me.
Anything else you want to share?
Yeah, this has been a fun conversation, and if anybody's lasted this long and listened to it, I'm sure I said things that you either said this guy's full of shit, or that's BS, or it triggered you, and that's fine. That's totally acceptable. I would encourage you, though, to use as an opportunity to understand yourself better by understanding why you're responding that way. What is your story about a thing that is producing that emotional response in you? Second, I would say, if you can learn to seek truth above right and wrong, an entirely different world will open up to you, and so will the truth. Most of us are far more interested in right and wrong than truth. Truth is sometimes terribly inconvenient. Last thing I would say is this last year, with your help, I started Quantum Academy, and I've had an absolute blast doing it. If somebody is looking for what I would call cognitive apprenticeship, which is to learn how to think, not what to think, then they may want to look into it. Could be useful. And if somebody has that prick that's like, man, I think I need to connect with this person, or I need to be part of this community, reach out.
Dude, I have one last question for you.
Okay. What do we got? Very old book, one that looks very old.
This is a very old book. And in it, there's a question that I want you to answer.
Okay. Oh, I know this book. I think I wrote in this book, did I not?
All right, the question is, if you could go back and tell your 20-year-old self one thing, what would you say?
Trust. Trust and remember. That's what I would say. It wouldn't change anything. We are exactly where we're supposed to be. But I would encourage myself to trust and remember.
That was your question. Yeah, you remember?
Yeah, I do. Yeah.
Thanks for coming on.
Awesome. Thanks, brother.